his experience and all that he learned and got to see and do at General Convention, including being elected to serve on the Executive Council, I think I saw. Is that correct? We look forward to hearing about that as well. Wonderful. All right, well, take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. First off, I want to thank Aaron and Robin for inviting me to speak here at St. Jude's. I applaud you and your congregation for interest in being on top of things with General Convention and to hear what's news. As you probably guessed, this is hot off the press. We flew back Tuesday. We ended last Monday. So I had a short time period to condense everything down to make the talk for you today. So anyway, thank you very much for having me here. General Convention normally is about 2 weeks long. And this time, because of COVID, it was postponed by a year. And we shortened it down to 4 days of work. So we're dealing with about 1,200 attendees, where normally it's close to 10,000 who attend. It's one of the largest conventions in the United States. The only people that were allowed to attend this time were the bishops, the deputies, one alternate from each diocese, and also a limited staff and the volunteers from Baltimore. 107 dioceses were represented. 400 clergy deputies were in attendance, and 402 lay order deputies were present, 110 bishops, and as I said, we had to cram a lot of work on the floor, so we did not have our normal committee meetings during the convention, but we held them prior to getting to Baltimore. All the resolutions had to have been submitted by June 6th. Committee hearings were online, and they were open to anyone who wanted to sign up. So the COVID caused a lot of new ways to do things for General Convention, and plus it was more inclusive because now anyone could sign in from around the world to hear the hearings and to testify on the resolutions that were present. So without the committee hearings, which normally are either in the morning or in the evening, we had 3 sessions of legislation nonstop. So we went from 2.5 to 3 hours each session, with 2 hours for lunch and 2 hours for dinner. And so it was quite interesting. We limited our services, and we weren't allowed to sing on the floor. So one of the funny things was during Eucharist one time, they played one of the old familiar hymns. And since we couldn't sing, as communion was going on, off in the distance you would hear a hum. Then a hum on the other side, and before you know, the floor was all humming. And so it was quite something. So we worked really hard, and we went to about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night each day, and we started at 8:30 on the floor. So a lot of fun. But we were air-conditioned, thank goodness. Some of the highlights that what I'm going to do in my presentation is talk about some of the things that happened, some of the elections. There were some real forward movement of the church that happened in this convention. Then I'll talk about some of the different areas of legislation that we dealt with, mainly governance, liturgy, social responsibility, and racial reconciliation. And so I'll get to some of those. This year, because of something that we did last time at General Convention, is the President of the House of Deputies has never been a paid position. And last General Convention, back in 2018, we voted to give the President of the House of Deputies a salary. And so because of it, we were able to attract new, younger people to run for President of the House of Deputies. As a result of it, the new President of the House of Deputies is Julia Ayala Harris, who was voted as President of the House of Deputies. She's the first Latina deputy elected, and is the youngest President of the House of Deputies. And so that's really saying something about it. We also voted the Vice President is Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton, and she's the first indigenous woman clergy ever elected as Vice President. They've had 3 women who served in the role of vice president, and she's the first clergy woman who's been elected as vice president. We elected, I think we elected about 12 members of executive council onto the council. The executive council is made up of 3 representatives from each of the provinces. There's 9 provinces in our church. And so there is the bishop, a lay deputy, and usually a clergy are elected from each province. So that gives you 27 right away. And then on the floor, we elect, there's another 6 that we elect. There's 12 total. They rotate 6 every convention. So there's 12 people who are voted from the floor of General Convention. Then the bishops elect 2 each General Convention, and then 2 clergy are also elected. So it gives you a total of about 47 members of the Executive Council. I was fortunate to have been nominated to be elected on the floor, but one of the other possibilities was a lay position open up in Province 8, which we are a part of. And with the election being held in the province level, I ran at that level and was elected through the province. So I'm the Province 8 representative. I'll be serving 2 trienniums. This time around, instead of 6 years, it's going to be 5 years. So I got off easy. And then another person that you all might know is, if you all know Julia McCrae Goldsmith, the Dean of Trinity Cathedral, her husband got elected to the church pension fund. So we're well represented in the national church and leadership. Now, to show you the work that we did, there were 431 resolutions that were submitted for us to consider. We acted on 414 of them. So you figure 4 days, 9 hours each day, how many we went through. And 17 were referred to subcommittees for further review or deferred to 81st Convention. Because of COVID and because of the short amount of time that we had, they instituted special rules for the House. And so the committees, when they were looking at the resolutions, they would consider the resolution and they had choices of either adopting them, recommend to adopt, or they could take no action, which basically kills it, or they could send it to an interim committee. So during the next triennium, a subcommittee would would review that legislation, or it automatically kicked over to the 81st Convention. So we also had what was a consent agenda each day. We had 2, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Consent agenda is when the resolution comes out of committee, they automatically put it into consent unless the committee votes to put it on the floor, or the President of the House of Deputies takes it off and puts it on the floor, or if on the day of hearing of the consent agenda, we could motion to take it off the consent agenda. So most of the resolutions that went through consent agenda, which means each day we'd have to, the first day we had over 100 resolutions that went through by consent. And very few got taken off the consent calendar. We trust the judgment of the committees and what they decided on. And the major ones, some of which I'll cover today, are those that got special time on the floor for special debate. We had 13 elections held, so 13 positions in our national church. Of those 13 elections that were held, 46 positions were filled. And I explained the consent agenda and how that worked. So because of the consent agenda, we were able to get through all our work. We actually finished early on the last day. We were supposed to go until 5, and we finished at lunchtime. And the House of Bishops were able to finish also. In fact, we dragged our heels in doing our resolutions, and all resolutions, like Congress, has to be approved by both houses, the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. And so they were waiting on their end for us to pass resolutions through to get to on their floor. And one of them was the budget. And we finally got the budget to them, and they approved it. So we both adjourned this time at the same time. They literally call each other and say, we are ready to adjourn. And the President of the House of Deputies would ask the House of Presiding Bishop, can we adjourn? And he'll say, yes, go ahead. Last convention, we finished before the House of Bishops, and they weren't pleased because they don't like the House of Deputies being more efficient than the House of Bishops. So, yeah, it was interesting because many of us went over to the House of Bishops to watch their sessions at the end, and we heard that they were not pleased that we finished before them. So now I'd like to get to some of the resolutions that we looked at, and I'm just going to touch on some of the key ones that probably are of most interest to you, and you've probably heard in the rumor mill of resolutions that were going through the process. So the one that's on the tip of everybody's mind is the prayer book. Are we getting a new prayer book or not? And that was debated at the last convention, and they kicked it over to a resolution this time, and it was debated again. Is the prayer book the main form and only form of liturgy for our church? The resolution finalized that the prayer book is the prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, and that it's not to be touched, but it is the main body of our liturgy. However, alternative services are allowed, and many of them have been approved at the diocesan level, and many of them have gone up to the General Convention for approval also. So those alternative services are allowed around the prayer book. The House of Bishops proposed an amendment to the resolution where it made sure that they kept their authorization to allow local liturgy. And so a bishop at our diocese can look at a proposed liturgy and approve it for use temporarily in our diocese. And then there is a commission called the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. And after the last convention, they formulated an online site where all the liturgies, they combined all the liturgy, the prayer book, alternative services, New Zealand prayer book, and others. It's all centralized in one location. Any of the liturgy that's contained on that website is available for anybody to use. And you could also petition the committee to have your liturgy included in that. And so it could be shared by the church. And so the clergy now have access to one central location to look at alternative liturgies and use that because it has been authorized to be used. So basically, for the church, the reason behind all this is the church to be current, to be attractive to different people, and to open up the church to everyone else, that alternative services should be allowed and it's authorized to be used. So that is where the prayer book is, and that basically I think that's where it's going to end. The hymnal we have not touched. There's always been talk of changing the hymnal, but it's always been the prayer book comes first before the hymnal gets touched. The other thing too is there is going to be a committee formed to look at the prayer book, and I'll get to the reasoning behind some of this, to look at the language of the hymnal and our prayer book for language of colonialism, sexism, and racism. One of the forward movements that is going to happen moving forward now is looking at how the church in our colonialism and how it developed over the years might have caused injury and discrimination. And so there's a lot of inward soul searching, if you will, about what the church stands for and what we did in the past and how we could rectify all that going forward. The other key one was the baptism as a requirement for communion. That was very hot. It looked like it might be moving forward until 28 theologians submitted a letter and a study to the committee saying that baptism is a requirement for communion. What the committee who dealt with this resolution did this time was Basically, they took no action on the resolution. So it didn't get on the floor. We never debated it. But what I think is going to happen, and from the emails that we saw after when the resolution was debated, is that there'll be a study done between now and the 81st General Convention. So we'll see it again at the 81st General Convention. Hopefully, the language of the resolution will be more acceptable to the deputies and to the church, in the general church. So keep your eyes open for comments, and those of you who are on blogs and so on, you'll be seeing a lot of that coming through. Commemoration of Bishop Barbara Harris in the Lesser Feast and Fast for September 11th was adopted. The requirements to get into Lesser Feast and Fast and on the church calendar usually is the person has to be dead for 50 years before they actually get on the list. So what they wanted to do was accelerate commemoration of Barbara Harris, but not circumvent the 50-year requirement. So they're taking steps to lay down the foundation that we can commemorate her on the 11th of February, which was the date of her consecration. And then when the time comes that she'll qualify, she'll get into the final list. One of our local resolutions that went to General Convention dealt with Peter and Annie Casey in Lesser Feasts and Fasts. And there were some corrections in their biography that need to be changed. Unfortunately, the committee referred that resolution to the 81st General Convention. But they are still in the Lesser Feasts and Fasts. They just corrected some biographical information. So our diocesan convention resolutions that we pass do get on the floor. So we are active in that. The next big topic is dealing with social justice. The presiding officers, meaning the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies, formed a committee after the last convention. And the committee was to look at racial equality and justice in furthering the beloved community. And what they did was study the history of the church, what we could do to rectify the past and to heal the church in what we're doing. The mandate is to look at a long-term project that probably will go as long as all of us live, and we will never see the end of it. The outcome of it was a resolution called Truth-Telling, Reconciliation, and Healing. And that is the mandate that the church is going to work on forward. Basically, the theory is that how can we as a church live into our faith and be honest to ourselves if we have a history that has done ill to others, our fellow brothers and sisters. So the task force is to look at looking at the history of the church, what we've done, colonialism, churches, slavery, all of that is to be looked at. And also, not just at the national church level, but also down at our diocesan level and our parish level. Some of the churches have already looked at their roles in slavery, their parishes. Maryland, the Diocese of Maryland, has already started reparations payments back to the black community because of the slavery that happened in Maryland and so on. And so they have dedicated some of their funds out of the diocese to help pay for and support local black communities in making reparations for benefiting from slavery in the early days. The committee is just starting to form. It's going to be funded from the holdings of the church. So we're trying to define what that means. It's going to be 10% of the profits from the holdings of the church. So I was on the Program Budget and Finance, which is the budget committee for the church. And there's a lot of a lot of definitions that need to be cleared up yet. And so we're waiting to deal with that. So we funded them to the extent to get them up off the ground and form the committee. The committee will be separate from the Executive Council. It wants to be an independent organization, but yet funded by the church, and we will have some oversight over that. So that's just getting off the ground. You'll hear more about it. And so just if you hear truth-telling and reconciliation, healing, that's the major movement that's going to move forward. Included in that is the study of the indigenous schools. As you all heard in the news about the indigenous schools throughout the country, and there were several Episcopal schools that were run by the Episcopal Church. So we are looking into how the church participated in those schools, how involved we were in it, what happened at those schools, and start gathering stories. There are still survivors that are out there. And in fact, if any of you who participated in our pilgrimage with race program here in our diocese, the person that I interviewed was the mayor of Sand City, and she's an indigenous person. And in the interview, she came out with a story about her cousin who got shipped off to one of those schools, escaped twice, and got hauled away back to the schools. And so there's a lot of history, and it's not just at where the reservations are, it's throughout the country, wherever you have indigenous people. So the church is trying to find out our history with it and to correct that and make amends with it. The other part, too, is a forensic audit of our holdings and look at our injustices that occurred caused by our church over all the years. So we're literally digging back to the beginning of the Episcopal Church and looking at the archives. We funded a person in the archives, the church archives, to help with this research, to help with the diocese and the parishes in digging out a history of their past to help in coming to heal. The other part is, if you all don't know, a lot of the countries in Province 9, and the Province 9 countries are mostly the countries that are in Central America, South America, and other parts of the world, and also all the indigenous dioceses and Navajo land. So what we are doing is, in the past, those dioceses have been supported by grant funding. And in the past years, we've held flat the amount of money that we give in grants to those dioceses. And what we've come to realize is that with inflation and all the cost of living adjustments and so on, their amount that we're funding them is going down. And so the program Budget and Finance this time took a bold move to, after hearing testimony from 3 bishops of some of these dioceses, decided to increase the funding by 5% over the next 2 years. And the 5% will only address, basically, bringing up the cost of living adjustments for people who were paid in those dioceses. It's not, unfortunately, going to fund a lot of new programs for them. But at least their clergy and their support staff and people who are doing ministry are being supported somehow in what they are doing. You can be sure that Program Budget and Finance next time will be looking at how we can increase that amount so that we can start supporting them. The other thing, too, is the Province 9 countries down in South America and Central America has always been on the basis of sustainability. We will fund you now, but you need to work on being sustainable in the long run. We have now changed that thought, knowing that they, because of the political climate that they're in down there and the poverty and so on, that they will never, ever be sustainable on their own. So the change of thought of how to fund those dioceses is changing, and we're having to look at how we could change things around and support them in other ways. The Israeli-Palestine relations, there were several resolutions that were presented. Only one was passed out of committee and adopted on the floor. Basically, the resolution says it recognizes the state of Israel. However, the church condemns occupation, segregation, and oppression of Palestine by Israel. And in order for Israel to be considered a democratic state, they must treat all people equally. And lastly, that we urge the President and Congress to oppose any Israeli laws and practices that will result in unequal rights for the two peoples. So we're taking a stance as to on that issue. The other, like I said, the other resolutions that some were a little harsher were not passed out of committee, and no action was taken on those. The next section is on governance of the church. And one of the key things, as I said, I was on program budget and finance. The budget of the church, which is $100.5 million, is created by the Executive Council's Finance Committee, and then it's turned over to the program budget and finance. We get it and we nurture it through all the resolutions, making adjustments as we see resolutions being adopted. We try to fund as many as we can. We talk to the staff at the headquarter office in New York, 815, and talk about how they might be able to absorb some of the work that is coming out of the resolutions being presented. And as a result of it, we then present the budget to a joint house of the bishops and the deputies, and we vote on it. And luckily, again, this year we were able to pass the budget with very little debate. So it showed that we did a lot of work in the committees, and the people agreed with what we funded at this time. There was a resolution this time that now the program budget finance is no longer. So my committee is now dead. What they've done is they have taken the process back into Executive Council, but create a separate committee, part of the finance, that is broader than just the members of the council, but also other representatives, other deputies that we could appoint into the committee. And the reason for that was, and as I've been on Budget and Finance Committee twice, is that you see how much repetition there is that occurs. We get the budget from Executive Council. We have the staff come into our meetings. They tell us the same thing that they've told Executive Council. We come up with our theories as to how we're going to fund things. We have to go back and explain, once the budget's passed, explain to Executive Council, who implements the budget, this is what we were thinking when we created the budget, the last version. So a lot of repetition, a lot of hard work, and this gives a better control throughout the process on budget for the church. And so that resolution was passed, so program budget finance is now defunct. So I worked myself out of committee, which is good. And hopefully it'll be a more streamlined process to do our budget in the future. There was a committee called the Status of the Church, and that was also formed by the presiding officers, and they staffed that committee over the last 3-4 years with only members of the younger deputies. So we're talking about, what is it, the Gen X's and whatever. So no one was over like 30, 40 years old in that committee. And the purpose of that was, what does the church need to be for us to be sustainable going forward? We don't want old eyes like mine in that committee. We need new, innovative ways. What they came up with was a report, and there were several things in the report that they are asking for. One is that we look at the parochial report. What is it asking? What is it telling us? And is it really accurate to show the vitality of the parish and the work that you do? And the secondly is to hire research assistants to look into the data that they're gathering from the parochial report, which will be revised to gather more data, and find out how the churches are going, who's working, how well is it working, and share that information throughout the church. So, and then the other part too, that it's curious that no one really knows how to define it. What does it mean to be a member of the Episcopal Church? So they're going to look at that, and that deals with baptism, communion, so on and so forth. So we're going to look into that as one of the steps. The other part is study of adaptive changes to governance. What we've learned in the pandemic is that we can do church a different way. And part of it is doing a lot more things online, our committee work, a lot of hearings, a lot of committees could meet together and not have to travel. In the past, committees met in person. We had to pay flight, hotels for them to meet. Now, it's all done online. And we have found that the committees and members have found that it works well for everyone in doing it. Plus, it makes the church more accessible to all of you at home. We are able to get more input. You are able to participate more and get information quicker. So we're looking at how we could adapt to the new environment, make it more friendly, get into the modern age. Use of technology, expand our technology so that it could be used by the interim bodies and communications. Surprisingly, a lot of researchers have not been used in the past to do a lot of work. The committees did a lot of the work themselves. We've now funded researchers to help in doing the work of the church. And as I mentioned, looking at congressional vitality, data gathering is crucial. The other part, too, is out of the recent actions by Supreme Court and the political environment around here, we are looking at where the church holds our general conventions. We plan our general conventions 2 conventions ahead. So our next convention is 2024, and that will be in Louisville, Kentucky. The next one, 3 years after that, 2027, we've named 4 cities as possible cities to hold the convention: Puerto Rico, Orlando, Phoenix, and I knew that, Charlotte. And so the question arises with the political climates in some of these states that are being considered, whether the church should be taking our business and our people into those states. The biggest fear is the protection of women's rights and those of the LGBTQ community. Do our members feel safe going to those areas and holding convention? Because we'll be back to probably, if not the 10, 11-day period, but at least a little longer than what we had this time. So if we go into an environment that is not friendly to the women and to LGBTQ, we shouldn't be there. The other thing, too, is, like I said, we're one of the largest conventions in the country. And so for us to spend our money in a community that doesn't support what we stand for is questionable. 2 resolutions we dealt with. One was to change Kentucky for the next convention. That one got voted down because it was pinpointing that particular convention. The one that was broader stated a policy that the committee that looks at sites considers when they look at the sites. And now that we've passed the 4 cities in the resolution, there's a committee on convention site planning. So now they will take the policy that we established and use those as guidelines on picking the city that we're going to. Unfortunately, probably in Louisville, Kentucky is going to happen. We tried to stop it, but with Baltimore and the COVID and changing last-minute things of hotels, convention time, and everything else, the church is losing $1.2 million because of that, because we had contracts with all the hotels for the 10, 11 days and so on. So we're going to lose out on that. So the committee is looking at Louisville, Kentucky, and seeing if there's a possibility of changing that. Chances are probably not. But 2027, we can look at those 4 cities and decide. And as you all might guess, the target is Orlando. Do we want to take our convention to Florida? And so it was a very heated discussion because people who are from Florida, and in particular that central Florida area, stood up and said, you are turning your back on us who are in the community. So it's a hard call to make. Yes, we are, but we need to also stand for what the church stands for and what we believe in. And so that committee will have to decide what we're going to do with those. Yes?
So 2024 will be the 81st General Convention, and that's, 2024 will be the 81st General Convention, more than likely in Louisville. And then the 82nd General Convention will be in which of those four places? Say those again.
It's up to the committee now. The committee is to look at the four cities.
Which are the four?
San Juan, Puerto Rico, Phoenix, Charlotte, and Orlando.
Orlando, okay, great, thanks.
So right now everybody's thinking, it wouldn't be bad going to Puerto Rico, for July, but we'll see. We'll see where it goes. Or you face 105 heat in Phoenix. Well, we faced the heat in Austin and the heat in Salt Lake City the last two times. Yeah, Robin?
When are they going to come back west again? Seems like, all those choices are, two in a row, two conventions in a row are back east.
We've had it in Orange County twice over the last 15 years.
There's Oregon and Washington.
We're looking at, and San Francisco, but you're looking at the cost of hotels, facilities. Baltimore, interesting, now that you brought that up, because we have gone, I'm not sure if those of you who've been around have heard deputies talk about the Blue Book. Well, the Blue Book used to be a binder this thick that you carried around. They copied all the resolutions, amendments, everything, and you carried them around. When I started in 2015, they turned everything electronic. So now we get issued a little tablet, and everything's on there. And it's called a virtual binder. And we call that our Blue Book also. And I'll have reference to it later on. But the virtual binder actually is online for you to look at. So those of you who want to dig into resolutions, you just go in there, click on the resolution tab, and then type in subject matter, a name, a word, whatever, and it'll pop up with all the resolutions that dealt with that subject. And then you can see what happened to the resolution. And you can also see all the people that were elected. So because of electronics, the facilities have to have the highest quality of Wi-Fi and so on. It worked well in Salt Lake City. They were a brand new convention center. And then it worked real well in Austin. Baltimore, not so well. We spent most of the first day getting Wi-Fi connection. We couldn't vote because they put the election mechanism into the tablet this time. Usually it's a separate handheld unit that we used. And you have a little card that you punch in and that authorizes you to vote. Unfortunately, it turned out, and I found out later from one of the staff members, is that the infrastructure of the convention center is antiquated and could not have, they had to, one night, they had to re-pull cables to support the Wi-Fi in the convention center so that we could work efficiently. And we spent a lot of time just sitting around waiting for people to get Wi-Fi connection and be able to vote. So it's crucial that those cities that we consider have that capability, plus have enough hotels surrounding the area that people could walk to the convention center and not have to be bused. So they've used Orange County because Disneyland is there, and in the past, families always travel with the deputies. And so they could go and have fun, and the deputies do their work. But yeah, we'd always like to try to bring it back over. I guess they considered Salt Lake City on the west, and that was just 2 conventions ago.
Well, that's closer. I mean, because it means that we are, the West, Midwest, West, are bearing the brunt of the cost of travel to get to wherever convention is.
Well, one of the options is Phoenix this time.
Yeah, it's closer. Not safer, just closer.
We're always trying, Robin. We're always trying. One of the new things, too, is that a creation of a director position at 815, the National Church Office. Several years ago, back in 2015, there was a program called TREC, where we streamlined all the subcommittees, committees, staff positions, and so on to save money. As a result of that, what once was the director of Women's Affairs got eliminated. And this time around, the resolution wanted to add back the Women's Affairs director, but we expanded it to include LGBTQI people in the mix. So the director position is now funded and in place, and so they will coordinate all those activities for the church. And the other thing too is things that we were doing in committees online before convention were not authorized by canons or the Constitution. And so we approved a resolution that now allows us to do work electronically before convention, and that includes taking action on resolutions also. Because what we had to do this time was committees could act on all the resolutions ahead of time, but they couldn't vote to adopt, table or whatever until you're at convention. So day one of the convention, they had to do an omnibus bill, and all this just gets pushed through. And so now it's going to allow them to do things ahead of time electronically. And memorable moments of General Convention. Those of you who know about Navajo land, it's down in the corners of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. And the Bishop of Navajo land, which is a separate diocese, has never had an opportunity to participate in the selection of the bishop for Navajo land. The bishop has always been voted by the House of Bishops and did not really get any input from the members of the diocese. So a very moving resolution we approved, giving members of the Diocese of Navajo land a say and participation in the selection process of the next bishop. And it's enabling them, it's recognizing them, and lifting them up. And it was very emotional when we voted yes. And we gave an ovation to Navajo land, and they stood up and went to the mic and in tears thanked the convention for recognizing them and finally giving them a seat at the table. So that was very moving. The other one is the Diocese of North Texas and the Diocese of Texas were merged. If you remember the schism in Diocese of Dallas-Fort Worth, and the Texas Supreme Court ruled, unlike all the other courts, the Texas Supreme Court ruled that the parishes who left the diocese and left the Episcopal Church to go to the conservative church had every right to the church, to the furnishings, to all of its belongings and funds. So it left those parishioners without a church anymore. In most of the other dioceses where this has happened, the courts have always ruled in favor of the Episcopal Church, that everything belongs to the Episcopal Church. Texas did not. And as a result of it, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, we will not hear it. So that ruling stands for Texas. So rather than turning our back on them, we reached out and they started conversations with the Diocese of Texas, and they have now merged. And so who once was the Bishop of North Texas is now the assisting bishop. So he kept his job, and they are now all one and the same. And that was another moving moment in the church. San Joaquin stood up afterwards and applauded them and wished them well, because what they went through in San Joaquin is very similar. So that was very moving. We said farewell to our President of the House of Deputies, Gay Jennings, after 10 years in office. And that's the maximum that she could do, is 3 terms. So she stepped down. And she's been with General Convention, I forget if she said 14 General Conventions that she's attended. The longest person who's been on General Convention or deputy to General Convention was the former Vice President of the House of Deputies. He has served 16 General Conventions. times 3, that's 48 years of your life working at General Convention. So that's quite something. And we recognize a lot of people who have served 10 General Conventions. And the other thing that became very evident is that we are the Episcopal Church, not of the United States, but the Episcopal Church of the world. So we are now known as the Episcopal Church, TEC. And because we have in Province 8 is made up of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of Province 8. We have all the dioceses in South and Central America. And then we have the church in Europe, the Episcopal Church in Europe. So we are a world church, and we need to recognize that. So I will leave you with some of the references. As I said, the virtual binder is still online, so all you do is just type in virtual binder, www.vbinder.net, and you could access that and see all the resolutions that we looked at and those that we didn't act on. There's going to be a summary of the convention actions. They're finalizing that right now, and I'm sure it'll be posted in the Episcopal News once that comes out, so you could access that. Then we have the General Convention website, which is generalconvention.org, and you could look at that, and it gives you a little bit more history and a little broader information than virtual binder about General Convention. And if you look at our diocesan website, we had blogs that were posted during convention. Katie Dickinson, thank you, was an alternate, a lay alternate, and she wasn't able to get on the floor, but each day she blogged on the activities and took pictures, and all those are posted on the website. So that's a very short summary of all the stuff that we worked on, but I think it's all the key things that you all would be interested in. And I'm open to any questions.
Any questions? We've got 8 folks joining us online. I've put out a call for questions. No questions yet.
Great.
Any in the room?
Thank you for joining us online.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending.
We do have a question. Mary Blessing.
Aha, Mary.
A question from Mary Blessing. I'd like to ask if he can speak to the mind of the House of Bishops comments Bishop Curry made regarding us leading a challenge to Christian nationalism.
I cannot, Mary. I'm sorry. I have not looked at that video yet.
I happened to be watching the House of, obviously Timothy was occupied in the House of Deputies, but from the wonders of the technology that Timothy talked about, I was able to watch live, the live stream of the House of Bishops when they were discussing this. And there was a lot of discussion that the presiding Bishop Curry put forth, and then the bishops discussed around how do we respond as an Episcopal Church, and especially for the bishops, to address this rising tide of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism in particular. And so there was no resolution that I'm aware of to that, no particular action taken. But there's a lot of really thoughtful and I think substantive conversation happening around that, from what I could see. Now, I may have missed things because I couldn't follow everything that was happening, of course. But I think there are a couple articles that I've seen about it, and we can certainly share those. And I suspect we'll be seeing more from the presiding bishop about all of this soon as well.
Yeah, Liz.
One resolution on Israel-Palestine passed. What were the others that were raised that didn't pass?
I'm going to sign off of my site. You know, Liz, it's going to be easier to go to virtual binder and type in Palestine, and it'll show you all the resolutions there. That'd be the easiest. And then you'd also see the supporting documents behind the resolutions, because there's a resolution, and then there's a whole document that supports the resolution. So I'd refer you to that. That way you'll get straight from the horse's mouth. Okay. Thank you, everyone. This can